like, what the hell is big hormone Enneagram? We have a fucking group on Facebook. Like, that's
Yeah,
all.
we
Like,
didn't intro any of it.
so I mean, that would be cool to know because that's some pretty interesting background. As to also just like how the fuck we approach the Enneagram. Like, the group is a pretty good representation of what the hell that is and why people are reacting the way they are to Enneagram universe and all that. So that's important. The big hormone Enneagram.
What are we here to talk about today?
Yeah, what are we here to talk about?
Well, I think, we touched a bit on typing and the importance of typing and blah, 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 but I think we have a lot more, I think, to talk about in terms of, like, for example, what Emeka was just speaking to, but I think Emeka also said a few things after the call, like, oh, we should have touched on blah, blah, blah. For me, I want to talk about inner work, and why typing is important from the point of view of inner work and not just, why it's not just a cool little hobby to have, but like why accurate typing and knowing your type and what it's all about is a useful thing.
Okay. I just told them before you came on that I wanted to redo my intro and include some of the background on how we met because it had some social elements that I wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
And also how the chat came about and how Big Hormone came about. Just
maybe we should redo just our intros.
Yeah, that's what I think. I think it would be probably good to do the intros like 3 times and
pick the best.
Yeah, pick the best one.
Ugh, I hate introing myself.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm going to have anything new or good.
I thought the one you did last time was pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, let's just see. I mean, yeah, maybe on the third podcast I'll have an intro. But yeah, I mean, the first one is I can always use the first one.
We're all sitting here judging how much new stuff you're going to come up with. Come on, David.
Oh yeah, that's the name crusher. Yeah. Terrible.
Dude, you're the most infamous person in the Enneagram.
The David.
Yeah, I guess that would be interesting to say.
That would be very interesting to say.
That's more to me, not as much the intro, but that's for you guys to say, like, how the hell did this happen? What's wrong with you?
If you want, I could just talk shit about you and we could all just talk about David.
That's a thing at some point. Yeah.
I think that's a great podcast.
Yeah.
I'd listen to that all day long.
Well, yeah, I'm not going to want to take it.
Can we try to understand why David gets so many people obsessed with him? Is that?
I mean, that's why I'm here. So.
Yeah. Anyway. Yeah. Intros. Yeah, I really don't have an intro, so fuck you.
Okay, I'll just redo mine. Get this out of the way. But I want to cover all this stuff, and then, all right. So I can just get started. So my name is Emeka. I got into the Enneagram about 10 years ago, and what initially hooked me into the Enneagram was that it was this real and experiential kinesthetic thing. I'd seen some typologists before and it just seemed like some theories on a page, and this was the first time that I could notice the types as they were happening in real time. So it became this really obsessive thing that I was just spending weekends and weekends studying and trying to feel out the types experientially. I had this fantasy that I could just walk into a room and figure out people's types immediately, and it was happening as I was getting better. So as a body type, I learned by doing. So that was my way of learning the Enneagram, was exploring types through kinesthetically, which basically informs the way I think I approach the Enneagram, which is an experiential, archetypal, intuitive, kinesthetic approach to the Enneagram, which I don't think there's a lot of approaches that factor that in for people. And so I think that's something that I'm bringing to the Enneagram that there's not a lot out there that has that approach. So this eventually led me to find people like David and John on forums. We eventually met on Facebook. And I want to explain a social element to this. For years, I never felt that I could connect with anyone in the Enneagram world because I looked around and didn't see anyone I could relate to until I met these guys. The Enneagram world is pretty old, white, and uptight.
And white.
Sounds like the name of a band, right? Like old, white, and uptight. We became friends over the years, along with some other young Enneagrammers like Nancy. And so a cool thing that has come out of these connections is a group that we run and a website called Enneagram Universe and Enneagrammer, started by a Social 4 friend of ours, Joseph Simone. So the group is a good representation of our collective approach to the Enneagram. We've gotten in trouble before, quote unquote trouble, our crew, you might call it, in other groups because of our approach to the Enneagram. So it's important to kind of explain why that might be. And it's because we have a lot of interesting things to say, but we're not afraid of negativity. We're not afraid of having heated debates. And for some people, they wanted social scenes that didn't have any negativity, didn't have any ideas that would start a ruckus. And we were really excited about those things. And so the group that we started is still to this day pretty infamous and starts a lot of controversies because our approach kind of is different. So I think one of the most important things is that people are free to express themselves, and we put a lot of priority on accuracy, which accuracy in typing, accuracy in representing the types correctly, which can really get people heated and get people upset. So in this group, we had a lot of like interesting creative things that we talk about, and one of them was Michael teachings, which is this esoteric spiritual system that I got into when I was obsessed, or still obsessed, with the Enneagram. I'm still interested in it. So Michael teachings is about archetypes, and in it, there are archetypes that you're attracted to. And so it became this huge thread. People wanted to figure out what their archetypes were, or archetypes they were attracted to, which became a group chat. And this group chat became pretty wild because it ended up being people just sending sexy selfies, root vegetables. We end up talking about astrology, end up talking about like Enneagram drama, and whatever you name it. So this
Chernobyl.
Chernobyl. So this group chat like became like a concentrated representation of the group in a way, where anything goes. And that group chat eventually became called, we eventually called it Big Hormone Energy, which is what this podcast is named after, which I think says something about the direction, the energy of what we're trying to do, which is this feeling of a freedom to express yourself, a personality, not only just the inner work and the nuance, but the fun and entertainment and the humor and the irreverence that in the way that we approach the Enneagram.
And we're horny as fuck, y'all.
Yes, and we're very horny.
All day.
So in terms of what I want to contribute to the Enneagram, or what I want to experience, is basically what I felt was missing when I first came into it, when I didn't feel like I could really get involved until I met these guys. It's like, I want to see more personality. I want to see more fun. I want to see more entertainment. Obviously, I want to see more accuracy. I want to see people who are getting their types correctly. But the Enneagram, I want to see more people getting loose and not only within a work, but just enjoying themselves. And I think that's going to attract a lot of young, interesting people over time as this stuff gets more mainstream. I don't want to see this just be dominated by old, dry, or overly religious, or whatever you name it. I do want to see some action and some personality in this thing. So I hope, besides the inner work and the nuance, that we're having fun. So that's
there's also the business slant besides the Christian thing, as far as it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I would, to add to what Emeka is saying, what I like about the name and the sensibility that it expresses is that my main interest in the Enneagram is inner work and the esoteric origins of the Enneagram. And when it comes to inner work and inner work groups of various kinds, there can be a very dry, very kind of self-retentive quality and a very kind of austere or sort of or it can be go to this to the swing to the new agey love and light, like hear my truth kind of way of expressing itself. Or another common one that David pointed out is the professionalism, where everything is sort of everybody's an ambassador for their brand, and everything is very also dry, and you're always sort of measured as a spokesperson for some brand you're supposed to be representing. And it's got this quality of being at like a conference with a lanyard around your neck and
literally
literally and literally presenting your new innovation, like almost like a technology conference or something like that. And especially people of our age group recognize is that the boundary between personal life and professional life is really kind of arbitrary, given especially like social media, and that most of us has been probably posting online since we were 12.
Yep.
And so I think what's interesting about it in terms of the Enneagram and inner work is that my emphasis has been the instincts. That's where a lot of my energy has gone to studying. And spirituality and inner transformation is not about getting a better personality, and it's not about overcoming your personality, and it's not about eating organic food, a whole food, rather than eating junk food, or having tantric sex instead of having normal sex, or joining a really elite spiritual group versus just hanging out with your friends. It's about a development of being rather than a change in the personality and instincts. And so with that in mind, a real spirituality doesn't depend on having this austere kind of guise or personality that comes with it. It's just another form of personality, is the spiritual personality. And so in big hormone energy and in this, and amongst the four of us and elsewhere and people that we're related to, I think that there is a very sincere, although different approach to inner work and spirituality and self-understanding and becoming more conscious and becoming a better person that escapes the trappings of a lot of the cultural framework or cultural signifiers of self-help and spirituality, and it stays about how do I be an awake person with my personality, rather than pretending like I've overcome my personality and pretending that my personality is not me as much as it's not me as much as essence is, but essence is something more inward, and it's not something that you can turn into a personality. So don't fall into the trap or the trance of trying to give yourself a spiritualized personality, because you're not only not developing anything from that, you're not getting anything except maybe some brownie points for people who like that. But it's not the real mark of transformation. And in especially some of the Sufi orders that I'm interested in, or not really orders, but there's a group that's actually pre-Sufi that became subsumed into Sufism called the Malamati, and their whole deal was showing no outward sign whatsoever. They were working inwardly all the time. And so we don't have to be so much like that, but their sort of central tenet was being Malamati means the way of blame, and it means being blameworthy in the eyes of all but Allah. Only Allah knows what's real for you. And so with that, it's like you can have fun, you can enjoy yourself, you can have sex and be horny and thirsty and do all that kind of shit. And at the same time, as long as you're actually present in all three centers, the spiritual and developmental piece becomes less about morality, which is generally based in social instinct, cultural kind of stuff, It becomes more about what helps you stay in integrity with your inner life and the deeper heart and the deeper mind, and the body of presence that we're trying to cultivate. And so it's not about losing what makes you an interesting person.
It just makes me think about the last time we had a meetup. We organized a meetup based on the chat, and I did a breathwork session with John, and that same night we went out and danced at a club. You know what I mean? Like, so just seeing that, like, that you can do inner work and you can better yourself without having this overly dry, uppity facade that you put on, that you feel like you have to put on to fit into that world. I feel like a lot of my friends who are into things like astrology, like a lot of young people are into astrology, a lot of interesting young people are into things like astrology and other spiritual systems, but for some reason the Enneagram world is somehow feels pretty stiff in comparison to a lot of these other scenes. And I think hopefully as things expand and grow and more young people get into the Enneagram, they're going to feel like, yeah, I can be myself and still be interested in this spiritual system.
Yeah, and that's to kind of back you on what you just said, Emeka. That's what kind of drew me to you guys, is because when I came into the Enneagram, I was 16, and I was like coming from a very Christian, Republican, strict kind of world, and kind of seeing the Enneagram, but then seeing how you guys handled it in this way that's kind of blunt and straightforward, which no one is blunt and straightforward to a 16-year-old, just FYI. And that's the most freaking annoying bullshit in the world. So that's what kind of drew me to you guys' group as I came to the conferences and got to meet you, was that you didn't like coddle the Enneagram. You're just like, here's what it is, and here's how you can work with it, instead of being like, oh, well, sometimes it's about sex. Oh, like freaking out about it. Oh my God. So
sorry, were you raised like, or did you come from a Christian perspective, or was that just like the milieu that you found the Enneagram in?
No, I was baptized in a Christian church when I was a baby. So,
whoa.
Yeah, and my family was Republican until recently. So
until recently, what happened? They
we all woke up. We were like, "Oh shit,
Trump happened."
Yeah, exactly. We're like, this is not okay anymore. So yeah,
truth trumped lies.
Oh wow, that's a dad joke.
Oh wow. Yeah. Interesting. I mean, yeah. I mean, to me, one of the overall themes here is that, I think we said it on one of our preliminary calls, that the appearance of good stops, needing to do the appearance of good stops actual goodness. And people know that. People sense that. I mean, that's what Christians need to know that. I mean, just being sincerely reaching out to Christians for a second, that's what turns people off about Christianity, is because people instantly know, that it's fake, that whole style of needing to be good, needing to associate yourself with a certain kind of goodness, moral, ethical, it somewhat becomes synonymous for people with actually underneath being deceptive, because it is a lie, right? Everybody's a mix, right? So that's kind of an overall theme here.
Yeah, I grew up in the church, big time. I make a joke. Huh?
Which church?
I'm not sure. Like, my parents would say that it's non-denominational.
Okay.
Oh no.
But which I think that's a category of its own now.
It is.
Yeah.
What church did you grow up in, Nancy?
Presbyterian.
Okay, I grew up Catholic.
Oh.
My mom was agnostic, so
lucky you. So a big thing in the churches that my parents took us to were these sort of faith movements. I don't know if you're familiar with that, any of you guys.
No.
Like, there's a lineage of a type of, it's called faith movement, the prosperity movement. Heard of that?
Is that where they think God wants you to get rich?
Yes, 100%.
Oh, I've
Joel
never heard of
Osteen and all
this.
that.
Joel, yeah, I don't know if Joel Osteen's one of the guys for that.
Yeah,
He's
he
more
is.
of a positivity. It's
Right.
me. But I remember in high school, my parents for vacation would take me to a Bible conference or one of these faith conferences in Oklahoma, and that would be like we would go to a buffet every single day, and we'd
Oh
go
my
to these
God.
conferences.
Oh God.
Help.
And that was like the most fun I had in high school.
Wow.
But anyway, yeah, just there's this very oppressive feeling of just being stuck in the church environment and of having to be a certain way, and then growing up realizing that a lot of people that I looked up to as righteous turned out to be some of the worst human beings I've ever seen. So because you don't expect it in that environment, expect that people are Bible followers and Jesus followers and practice the Bible and all that stuff, but in reality, people are just as terrible in church as elsewhere.
I can
Well-
tell you in the business world, just briefly, I'm the old guy here, so I've actually been a dork and done some business. And when and
I've
when
done work.
You're the only one.
yeah, and the only one. And I can tell you just generally in that world, when somebody starts talking God and Jesus and stuff, you know, literally 100% of the time that they're going to be shady. I mean, every time. It's not,
Yeah.
there's not even, you don't even, at a certain point, you realize you don't even give them a 1% chance. It's just, they're hiding behind that in order to do some kind of deception at some point. And they're tricking themselves. It's not as if it's perfectly cynical, right? That they're absolutely doing it as a
Cover up.
ask. Yeah. But it's just, it's going to come up, and it does every time. And basically you just cut it off right then once that starts happening.
That's
So,
interesting.
I want to, because if we're having this out there, since a lot of Christians are getting into the Enneagram, I don't want
Right.
any Christians to think we're just shitting on Christianity. But there's a difference between the culture of Christianity and the the ways that it gets severed from the messages of Christianity and gets turned into its opposite,
Yes.
versus the actual spiritual constellation and imagistic orientation of Christianity. That there are there's a real mysticism of Christianity in some areas, but for the most part, especially at least my experiences in the United States, there is a different kind of Christianity that calls itself Christianity, but has nothing to do with actually living any kind of example of Christ or inner development or awakening in any sense, but is kind of a weird amalgam of just people who are sincerely trying to be good people, but often are looking outside themselves for guidance, and then that gets combined with a weird infusion of capitalism.
Mhm.
As you're speaking to that prosperity shit, but even it's even more subtle than that. But that's just a really overt example. And then it crosses over into weird nationalism and
Politics.
politics and
Yeah.
white nationalism and ideology, and a lot of Christianity, and it sounds like the flavor that you're speaking to have experienced in business, David, is sort of on the level of just cultural signifiers with no real inner life to it. So like on a retreat I was teaching recently, I was commenting on this because somebody was asking about why are we seeing all of a sudden all this Enneagram stuff related to Christianity, and I was describing how like there's a certain level of emotional thinking. It's like the emotional center destroying the mental center, where certain symbols that have no inner significance just are sort of associated with each other. So like just really plainly like guns and Christianity. Like they're so tied together, and you'll see somebody like, with a Christian cross holding a big rifle, which is intended to kill a human being or defend yourself or whatever. But, that is so radically out of line with any example that Christ was making. And they might use little biblical verses or something to justify it, but it's real. Everybody knows it's bullshit, and they do too. But it's just sort of thinking of like cross, gun, America, blue jeans, truck, camo, simple life, working man, small business owner, soldier.
I'm really enjoying.
Business owner.
I'm really enjoying this character.
Yeah, well, it's like there's no thinking involved. It's just sort of emotionally charged signifiers that mean nothing, and they're all sort of related to each other. So like, that's why like somebody like Trump can be some weird example of a holding Christianity while like saving the unborn while putting kids in concentration camps. It's like, because there's no mental center involved. It's like this weird emotional gut distortion of cultural signifying. So when it comes to Christianity and the Enneagram, one of the things that we've talked about in some of the preliminary calls is how that the newfound Christian and evangelical Christian interest in the Enneagram has flavored the way the Enneagram is being taught and understood, and how it's being talked about. And besides a lot of the major teachers in general being, mistyped, they and then therefore describing types based on their own mistyping, which then perpetuates this sort of cycle of people reading that going, oh, I must be this type, and it sort of self-reinforces, where if enough people think they're the mistype, then the mistype becomes like
the type,
right? So there's that going on, but there's also a way of sort of flattening, in my view, the Enneagram. And because it is so much of this sort of solar ascending, like either knowing yourself so that Jesus can save you, or you can be self-aware or whatever, and just get along better with people and have a better personality, or just sort of sanitizes a lot of the potency of the Enneagram. And the Enneagram is so effective because it's just like a laser into what you're unconscious about. And it's trying to do so. This Christian kind of take on the Enneagram seemingly is trying to do so by eliminating the unconscious.
Does anybody know exactly how the Christian teachers are trying to integrate the Enneagram into how are they integrating the Enneagram into Jesus? How are those two things? How are they saying that the Enneagram is going to help you get closer to Jesus? Because I've heard people say that, but I'm not exactly sure how they're teaching that.
So I don't know everybody, but I was listening not too long ago, a pastor introducing the Enneagram, and he was probably a 7, and so it had that kind of sort of quick thing, and it was optimistic, and it's not bad. Like, it's not bad what he was saying, but he was sort of something about like, it's kind of like that Jesus helps those who help themselves kind of idea. But if you know yourself, then you're better. You're able to better fulfill the mission of Christ, and you're able to. I can't remember how he said it, but it's of that similar principle where it's like you can be redeemed, helped, whatever.
A better vessel.
Yeah, but by knowing yourself, which is actually true and is actually useful, and that appeals to a certain level of understanding, as well as a certain some people just resonate with different cultures, different signifiers, different things like that. And so it's not, that in itself is not bad, and it's not bad that Christians are using the Enneagram, because it actually gives a certain kind of praxis to their spirituality, which is something that the Catholic Church eliminated a long fucking time ago.
Yeah.
What does that word mean?
Praxis, the practice.
Oh.
There's like there's the belief, which is actually a detriment. Belief is a detriment to spirituality and faith.
Mm-hmm.
But then, the early Christian church prior to the takeover of the Catholic Church had a kind of had praxis, had a way that they understood that you develop spiritually. Whereas a lot of Christianity today is based on, some in Catholic Church it's good works, but in sort of being a model, like living in the model of Christ, that's usually thought of as morally alone rather than any kind of inner work. And then in like most of modern Christian churches, it's just being saved, which is just generally a ritual that accompanies a kind of belief. And so it's a very flat and very horizontal understanding of spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I die and then I go to heaven.
Yeah.
And we all go to heaven and we hang out there.
Right.
Forever. How boring. And I think one of the, I think it is great that it's coming into churches and that churches are starting to talk about it. But I think one of the more hurtful sides of it is this kind of theory that if you learn your type, Christians still have this idea that the bad things you do are sin. And if you learn your type, you can, better kind of guard against these sinful habits like anger and shame and these emotions that just come up and should be welcomed and should be understood and sat with, but instead are looked at as shameful or sinful or bad, but are really just part of your type structure and are not going to go away.
That's a great point. I'll shut up.
That's a great point.
I'll shut up soon, but just to, I know I've been talking a lot, but so what's interesting and what I think that the Christian Enneagram thing is missing is that a lot of Enneagram stuff actually comes from Christianity. That the part of the central suffering of each type, the passion, they share the name of the 7 deadly sins plus vanity and fear, because there was originally definitely 8 and maybe 9, and they weren't understood the way that they're understood today.
Right.
But they were developed in the earliest Christian monasteries in the world, which were in Egypt, and they were recorded by a monk named Evagrius, and they were called the logismoi, and they were called tempting thoughts, but they were understood to be things that distract you from having your attention fully on the divine presence. And so, you're in a fucking monastery in the desert of Egypt, and you start noticing what makes it difficult to inhabit a quality of attention that, the divine is at the forefront of your awareness all the time. And there's a great book by a woman named Angela Tilby that I've told you guys about. It's about the 7 deadly sins in Evagrius. But the first sin they identified was gluttony, which is the 7's passion, which isn't I like to eat a lot, which is how we understand it today, but it was wanting to be somewhere else. Wanting, like, not being satisfied by the moment, by needing something else to satisfy me. And in the religious language of early church, it was something other than the presence of God to satisfy me. And so it goes on from there. And so these sins were not a bad thing you do, like a law you break. They're a way that your attention becomes absorbed or identified with something other than Christ or other than God or other than divine, which is very much how every tradition that has that involves inner work understands inner work. So there is a way in which it's just as you're saying, Nancy, it's like recontextual, like you're actually suppressing yourself rather than becoming more free inside by labeling, whether it's sadness or anger or hate or whatever's going on in you. Those things can be transformed, but they can only be transformed if they are made conscious and if you're present with them and you're not trying to change them too quickly. That you are able to actually take a full account of the whole status of your of your consciousness and unconsciousness, your whole psyche, and see what's happening there and not be identified with it, and see that you didn't choose your type, you didn't choose your instinct, you didn't choose who you are, you didn't choose your body. And if there is anything that is quote unquote spiritual within us, it's the thing that can wake up and be separate from, yet still present to all that stuff. It's something that is an inner life that stands apart from the phenomenon of our bodies and our psyches. And so, as you're saying, Nancy, it's like if you're repressing all these qualities and reactions and feelings in yourself, that's very different from being present with them and not acting them out mechanically. And by repressing them, you're not gaining any self-knowledge. You're actually just creating more problems for yourself and other people and more suffering.
I think that's a big part of like church culture is that they tend to, I don't like to use this word, whitewash or just gloss over.
Well, you kind of do.
just gloss over anything that's negative. And I'm noticing that the way, well, type 4 is the most mistyped type by a large margin. Let's just say like half the people who get into the Enneagram think they're type 4 and they're not. And so one thing I've noticed with the Christians really getting into the Enneagram and that being really popular is that anything negative about type 4 has been deleted. It used to be that people would mistype as type 4 because they wanted to be edgy and cool. And now it's that type 4 from in the Christian circles has been remade to be this empathetic and totally feeling service oriented, creation that's based on church culture that, so many women have, mostly women are interested in the Enneagram. So that identify with type 4 see themselves as such a heartfelt and feeling, I can feel deeply with you.
Hashtag all the feels.
All the feels. And so type 4 has become this really positive, angelic type that has nothing negative. So just even saying that type 4s are self-absorbed and frustrated and disappointed and all these things that are just real. It's
and that 4s actually don't have a problem with owning.
Yeah.
It's a huge problem, I think, in reconciling church culture and the church lens with the negative realities about some of these types, because that's just not what happens in church. People don't. It's the negative aspects are looked as these are sinful things about my personality that I have to overcome by the grace of the Lord. and if I veer off into anything negative, then I've sinned. And so I think that's going to be a huge stumbling or a huge roadblock in Christians being able to get real about their types, is that no one wants to talk about what's wrong about the types.
One of the things about and this is not just related to people who identify as Christian. This really has an impact on our whole cultural sense of any kind of, like, I'll call it spirituality. And when I say spirituality, I mean any efforts made to understand and experience oneself apart from one's conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't have to be any kind of mystical experience, but generally, if you step outside that boundary, you get to those places. But the first door of entry into anything like that, into anything spiritual and authentically spiritual, and anything actually psychological, anything of the inner life at all, the first door is seeing past your self concepts. It's seeing yourself as you actually are versus seeing yourself as you'd like to be or imagine you are. And the thing about this repression that Nancy's speaking to is that there's so much pressure to be quote unquote good, that and be kind of a perfect, and, well, obviously, like, Christ is enough, or my family is enough, and, like, these should be enough for me. What happens is that it encourages a self-image that is very divorced from a person's actual manifestations. And that discrepancy creates a lot of obstacles to self-knowledge. And I mean, that's like the obstacle, really. The main obstacle, at least at the beginning of any inner practice, is that you're upholding a whole view of yourself that is probably not accurate. And the Enneagram if you're finding your type, it's going to be horrifying because you're going to see what you're like to some degree beyond what you thought. Even if you know your type, but when you really like, you don't have a mistype, but finding your real type, it should be shocking. It should be sort of horrifying.
Yeah, and kind of what you were just speaking about, a little branch off of that. I think the Christian culture kind of creates, or really like the commercialized spiritual culture kind of creates the need for a like spiritual arc. And like once you hit the other side of this hill, you'll magically be like never slide back down that hill.
Right.
Whereas like in my experience, it's constantly like dipping back into lack of presence and then coming back out of it into presence and then dipping back into lack of presence and then being caught up in my type structure and then et cetera, et cetera. Whereas it's not an arc, it's just a constant back and forth.
Do you know a couple years ago, John, when you started posting a lot about instincts and kind of the vitriol that people had, I think a couple of religious people, it felt like a religious reaction, just the notion that instincts were from our animal, like were animal instincts. And so I remember some people online who had posted that, no, I'm not an animal. I don't have animal instincts. I'm a sanctified saint of God. You know, that kind of I'm way above these base impulses that you're speaking of. And I feel like that's a symptom of the church culture, is to pretend like instinctual needs aren't a constant part of daily life, that because you go to church every week and you read your Bible, that you've somehow transcended these negative aspects of being a human being. And so it's just not being real about what the hell's going on.
A lot of the people that push back initially, like there weren't so many Christians. They were just sort of very, you know, like that kind of white professional class type.
Yep.
That, you know, do probably have some kind of Christian background, but I don't think they would identify.
It's more culturally Christian, kind
more
of.
Culturally than somebody who's like a sincere church goer or something.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very much a white upper middle class professional milieu that's like, you know, you can't be real about human sexuality and you know, like sort of just a really poor understanding of human biology apart from cultural preferences, you know?
Yeah.
So like you know, this was not long ago at all. This is like even just 4 years ago.
That was 3 years ago. I remember
3 or 4 years ago, and it's like, you know, talking about women being horny.
Yep. That was controversial.
That never happens.
It never happens.
We got kicked out of a group specifically about the sexual instinct, talking about the sexual instinct.
Well, like every time I talk about sexual as an instinct for sexual attraction, like that's a motivational drive to sexually attract, you know, I was getting a lot of, on one hand, people being like, hell yes, men and women, hell yes, that's what it is. And then a lot of men and women also being like, well, that's a male interpretation of sexuality because only males are have sexuality in mind.
Wow.
And it's like, you know, there's arguments to be made that for sure that men and women experience sexual interest and arousal differently, but in terms of a kind of a sexual appetite, it's not my experience that men are just a lot more horny than women.
Right.
There's just a totally different approach and sort of mechanism of how that, you know, like men could have less hesitation.
It's also inconvenient too to the sort of professional Enneagram folks for the sexual instinct to be what it is. It's because you can't go into you know, corporate world and talk about that stuff, you know, in its reality, right?
Even though,
whereas
like,
if you made it 1-to-1 and you made it about nesting and coupling, and it's like, oh, okay, you just totally chopped off its genitals and yes, come on in.
I heard
Well-
that's why Catherine changed the name, was that their corporate clients demanded that she couldn't use sexual.
Yeah.
the
That's
name.
absolutely why.
And that makes sense. I mean,
Yeah.
but still,
It makes sense, and it's why that's maybe not the place to do that kind of whatever teaching.
I mean, I guess like there's no use in a business environment for the sexual instinct. But how do you fit that into business operations?
You
you might be you might be interested in fucking your boss.
Or you might think about it a lot.
At the very least, anybody like I just feel like you have to, like, if you're teaching the Enneagram, it's going to be anything more than just like, what's your type? It has to be a sincere confrontation, not even a difficult confrontation, but just a confrontation with what's real about being human.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can be in a business and it's like, like it's worse in a business situation where it's not appropriate to act on the sexual instinct. You have to at least acknowledge and own it so that you can not act on it, versus going, if somebody looks at you this way and they grab your ass, it's because they want to start a monogamous relationship.
I mean, here's the thing: people still act on it. Most relationships start from work, so acting like
right.
isn't happening. Like, people are still fucking at work, so like you can't pretend like this isn't going on. Like that. Like, you're not going to talk about people having sex at work, but that's where most people meet.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, in a golden age, you could do the sexual instinct at work and have that be, what your corporation talks about, or whatever, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
that'd be great.
This is our corporate cuddle puddle.
Right. It's getting very wet here.
The corporate polycule.
Very sloshy.
It would actually probably help if the sexual instinct was taught in a work environment, because it's one of those things where when you repress an energy, it starts spilling out in these inappropriate ways.
Exactly.
Just maybe they could talk about how do you navigate the sexual signals that someone else is sending in a work environment.
I think this is a great topic, and I want to, like, because I imagine whoever's listening who doesn't know like where we're coming from in terms of the sexual instinct, like I just want to give a quick overview of how we're making a distinction.
Yes,
that's a good idea.
So, the instincts, self-preservation, sexual and social, are a major part of the Enneagram personality, but not a lot of people know why. And the reason is because they're animal biological drives that we get psychologically identified with. So otherwise we wouldn't study them, apart with the Enneagram, because in the case of the instincts, they're things we get psychologically identified with and base our self-concept on unconsciously. And then the thing about them is that they're not appetites. It's not like the sexual instinct, for example, is the appetite of sexual lust, but it's the motivational drive to ensure that somebody's attracted to you in case you want to have sex. And just like self-preservation is not hunger, the appetite of hunger, it's the motivational drive to make sure that you have the resources available in case you get hungry or whatever your body needs. Mm-hmm. So traditionally, it is believed that these categories came from Sufi psychology, but I don't know what branch of Sufism, but this is what Achazo said. Oscar Achazo, who synthesized a bunch of systems and came up with the modern Enneagram, incorporated them into his understanding of the Enneagram, but he had some kind of kooky ideas about them. And then, which would be an interesting thing for all of us to like look into at some point and try to really make sense of. And then Claudio Naranjo studied with him for about 8 to 10 months, and then came back to, I can't remember where he's from, but he taught in California a lot, and he taught the instincts were not biological instincts. He was influenced by a mentor of his and based his understanding of the instincts, which should be appropriately called subtypes, on a Gurdjieffian understanding of the subdivision of centers. And so he equated self-preservation with the body center. He equated sexual with the emotional center. He equated social with the intellectual center. And you can kind of see his logic, but I don't think it holds water. So that's why when people talk about self-preservation, they forget a lot of the more dynamic parts about self-preservation and sort of get to like just the comfort parts, which is another thing we can talk about sometime. In terms of sexual instinct, people have cleaned up the sexual instinct. And part of the reason I think so is because sexual instinct is unpredictable. You can't predict who you're going to be attracted to for how long. If the person you're attracted to is going to be attracted to you back, all that kind of stuff. It's unstable. So they, in equating it with the emotional center, sexual instinct has been described as intimacy or one-on-one. It has a one-on-one quality because it's, you're focused on a particular mate or potential mate, but it's not a personal sharing instinct. It's very penetrating rather than receptive and reciprocal. And it's not intimacy because intimacy is a heart quality. You can have sex with no intimacy. You can have sex with a lot of intimacy, whether or not your heart is involved. And social
attraction as well.
And attraction, right?
Right.
And just to say, lastly, that the most intimate human experience I think that there is probably the bond between mother and child. That's not sexual instinct. And it's amazing how many people try to say, "Oh, but that's sexual instinct." It's so weird. It's not. It's
weird.
social.
Yeah.
And the reason that the social instinct evolved in animals is that when their nervous systems got so complicated, they couldn't just, hatch from the sea turtle shell and just go to the ocean and then just be a sea turtle. They needed parenting. And so that the instinct of actually caring about another animal is a social instinct, and it extends one-on-one. It extends between parent and child, but it applies to all human relationships. And so part of what we're looking at is the sexual instinct, all the instincts really more appropriately defined to reflect our actual biology so that we can better understand our psychology rather than cleaning it up so it's more palatable to our culture or our personality or whatever.
That's a huge point, because I think a lot of huge misconceptions have been made around the instincts, and it was a huge point of struggle for me when I was trying to figure out my shit and figure out what my type was. And I, of course, everyone comes into the Enneagram thinking they're a sexual 4. But when you try to actually unpack what that means and you start looking at the material, you can't actually make any distinctions that are useful. So I think it was a really big deal to discover the notes that I found a while back that you, John, had put up, and some David's stuff that really started to open up the instincts and to see them from a biological standpoint. And just to see that information spread more and more and to watch people's reactions to it, it's just out of control, insane. That when people are confronted with the real sexual instinct, they are reacting in a way that is predictable to how someone would react to the sexual instinct. Which is, this is a disruption. This is dangerous. How dare you? It's been really
penetrating.
Yeah. And so, this is a big topic, like the way people have been responding to the instincts, and eventually getting into like the collage exercise, and how that's been a big thing. Like we could really get into that, and I think we've hit on an hour so far.
We're getting close, yeah.
Yeah. So that's a big topic.
Yeah, that is a big topic, but it's important.
The elements piece is it's helpful there too. If you think about my association with the instincts and the elements, just briefly, air for social, the classical 4 elements: air, fire, water, and earth. Air is social, earth is self-pres, sexual is both fire and water. And fire and water are, unstable, and they're sort of problems, right? Like well, let's put some water at work, you know what I mean, at a corporate environment, a flood or a fire, right? It's a problem, you know what I mean? It's unstable. If, you know, you're exposed to water, you're wet. It's like, I'm wet. What happened, right? You know what I mean? It's like that's a non-natural, well, not non-natural. It's
Well,
not
we don't
the
have
typical
gills.
state of things, right?
Right.
And to be burning is not the typical state of things, right? It's a problem, right? So
Hopefully.
whereas air, right? There's air all the time, all around, and it's kind of the mundane truth of things. So it's sort of special, let's say, to be wet or to be on fire, right? So it's a problem, right?
Mhm.
So you know, in various contexts, in various ways. So that's another way to conceptualize the issue of the sexual instinct and all the things that come with trying to put it into all kinds of contexts, including, I mean, that's why it gets neutered into one-to-one and intimacy and, you know, uh, just mate bonding in a more tame way, is because those elements sort of force that almost, right? So
Too much danger.
What would for those who don't speak David, what would being wet or on fire mean?
well, it has multiple different contexts. Can you ask it another way? Or
like, so, you know, like when you say being wet at work,
yeah.
Part of being wet is things become slick, the boundaries become less defined. There's a way in which, like, wetness is what breeds certain kinds of growths, but it's also like thought of as sexual fluids and sexual arousal. So all those things are kind of evoked where it's dissolving certain hard boundaries and creating a lack of control where you can't parse things out in different boxes as like like at work is a professional setting, and it's like, this is the box where the papers go and this is where those go,
Right.
and this is how you say hello and greet a client. But if everything's wet, it's like,
yeah,
you know, think about like people avoiding getting rained on.
exactly. That's what I mean is that. So like, yeah, so taking the baton there. So yeah, imagine one of those big rooms, you know, with a bunch of desks and people at all these desks and rows and rows and rows. And now imagine that everybody's waist high in water, let's say, right? So now, just let's say waist high, then that means now people's bodily fluids are possibly starting to connect and touch other people's bodily fluids, right? or fluids that have floated around people's genitalia are floating around everybody's genitalia, and so on, right? So it's a mess, right? And yeah, all the papers, yeah, and all the papers are wet. You can't get anything productive done like that, right?
You can't file anything. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a very problematic thing.
Here's an example.
Go ahead.
When there's a water spill at work, they put up a caution sign that says wet floor.
Yeah.
Because if there's no caution sign, you're going to slip and fall.
Yeah.
And so this idea that things can slip into each other dangerously, unpredictably.
Yeah.
That's a water kind of like makes things, like you said, a mess.
And fire, of course, is dangerous, right?
Yeah.
Fire and explosion and, you know, all of that kind of thing. And like orgasm is an explosion, right? I mean, it's, yeah. So, and part of what water, again, in the context of David speak, yeah, like you said, John, is the sexual fluids, and but it's also, if you think about it, saliva, kissing, right, and oral sex, dare I mention. And
Oh my goodness.
And I mean,
Oh my.
life probably
my.
started. Life on Earth probably started near
water.
those
In
in
ocean.
water in the ocean near those thermal
Yep.
vents. So you have
Absolutely.
lava, fire
So you've
meeting
got
water,
heat and water. Exactly.
conceiving
It's the
something.
origin point.
Yeah, and then
sex.
your water breaks, giving ready to life, to birth,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yep.
yeah.
Yep. And generally, water is feminine and fire is masculine. And if you think about woman has multiple liquids, right? There's
Mhm.
menstrual blood, there's milk, lubrication, etc. Right?
Mhm.
Woman's sort of got a couple of extra fluids going on that the men
We
don't
are
have.
so hydrated.
Yes. and then there's the cyclical nature of what is it called? Edema, water weight gain, and
Oh.
the connection into and so there's a fluctuation of water with women, and the menstrual cycle related to the moon, and the moon controls the tides and the water, right? So it keeps going on and on.
Well, I think this would be an interesting intro into the next
Episode.
episode.
Sure.
Yeah. On.
Trying to
I
cut us
agree.
off.
Yeah, I am.
Gotta get to bed.
My self pres is kicking in like it's 9:06, Nancy. You have to get up and eat T minus 10 hours.
What's our outro gonna be? What are we saying again? I forget what we did. Something.
Now, what did we do?
It
it'll
was
be,
all of us in unison
Oh yeah.
saying thank you for listening to the Big Hormone Enneagram or something.
Oh yeah.
Like
Is that what
We
we
are-
are?
Nancy just did it, so
Yeah.
that. We
I
all
think-
have to say it together though, creepily.
Okay.
Fours, you can't get him to do stuff simultaneously.
I know. He's gonna be like a beat off or
We're
something.
gonna strip him of all his uniqueness.
it won't be subsumed.
A beat off, that says a lot.
So, all right, we should just say that this is a wrap. Thanks.